On the morning of December 6th, 1917, a man named Vince Coleman sat in a small wooden railway office near the Halifax waterfront, tapping out the ordinary business of an ordinary day. He had about 4 minutes left to live, and in those 4 minutes, he would make a choice that almost no one would make, a choice that saved hundreds of strangers he would never meet. To understand why Vince Coleman ran toward the thing everyone else was running from, you have to understand what was floating in the harbor that morning. Because for about 20 minutes, the people of Halifax stood at their windows and watched a beautiful fire on the water. They had no idea they were looking at a bomb. To understand the morning, you have to understand the war. By the winter of 1917, the First World War had been devouring a generation of young men for over 3 years. And the entire war effort, every bullet, every boot, every loaf of bread sent to the Western Front, depended on one dangerous, unglamorous thing: ships crossing the Atlantic. The problem was the German U-boats. Submarines were hunting the shipping lanes, sinking supply ships faster than they could be replaced. So the Allies came up with an answer: the convoy. Instead of sailing alone, merchant ships would gather in huge groups, guarded by warships, and cross the ocean together. And they needed somewhere to gather. Halifax was perfect. A deep, sheltered, ice-free harbor on the edge of the Atlantic, with a wide inner basin where dozens of ships could anchor and wait. Almost overnight, this quiet Canadian port became one of the most important pieces of real estate in the war. The city swelled. Soldiers, sailors, dock workers, and their families crowded into the north end. The harbor filled with vessels carrying troops, horses, grain, and, increasingly, munitions. Tons and tons of explosives, passing through a working city packed with ordinary people, every single day. Everyone had quietly agreed not to think too hard about that. And on the morning of December 6th, 2 ships were about to make it impossible to ignore. The first was the Mont-Blanc, a French freighter under the command of Captain Aimé Lemedec, guided that morning by a local harbor pilot named Francis Mackey. She had come up from New York, and she was riding low in the water because her holds were packed with one of the most dangerous cargoes ever loaded onto a single ship. Let me actually list it because the numbers matter. Roughly 2,300 tons of picric acid, a wickedly unstable explosive. About 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of gun cotton, and stacked on the deck in metal drums, 35 tons of benzol, high-octane fuel. The Mont-Blanc wasn't a ship carrying explosives. The Mont-Blanc was an explosive, with a crew sitting on top of it. She'd been loaded in New York under such secrecy that she wasn't even flying a red flag to warn other ships what she carried. The captain feared it would make her a target for submarines. So the most dangerous ship in the harbor looked exactly like every other ship in the harbor. The second ship was the Emo, a Norwegian vessel chartered to carry relief supplies to starving civilians in occupied Belgium. She was running empty, riding high, and she was running late. She'd been delayed taking on coal the day before, and her captain, Håkon From, was impatient to get out of the harbor and across the ocean. 2 ships, one desperate to leave, one quietly carrying enough explosive to level a city, and between them, a narrow channel. The channel was called the Narrows, exactly what it sounds like, a tight neck of water where the harbor pinches in before opening into the basin beyond. There are rules here. Ships pass port to port, left side to left side, like cars on a road. But that morning, everything went wrong by inches. The Emo, steaming out, had already been pushed off her proper course by other traffic. She'd passed one ship on the wrong side, then had to swing wide around a tugboat towing barges. By the time she entered the Narrows, she was riding down the wrong side of the channel, heading straight for the incoming Mont-Blanc. The 2 ships saw each other, and then they began to argue in steam. The Mont-Blanc gave one short blast. "I am holding my course." The Emo answered with 2. "I am turning into your path." 1 whistle, 2 whistles. Back and forth, neither giving way, the gap closing the whole time. At the last moment, both captains panicked, and both made the worst possible choice. The Mont-Blanc cut her engines and turned hard to avoid the collision. At that exact instant, the Emo threw her engines into reverse, and the force of it swung her bow around, directly into the side of the Mont-Blanc. At 8:45 in the morning, the Emo sliced into the hull of the Mont-Blanc. It wasn't even a violent collision, a gash, a grinding of metal. On almost any other ship in that harbor, it would have been a fender bender, an insurance claim. But as the Emo reversed and pulled free, The scraping steel threw a shower of sparks down into the Mont-Blanc, and into the drums of benzol stacked on her deck, and the most dangerous ship in the world caught fire. The French crew understood instantly what was underneath them. They knew there was no fighting this fire, that the flames were eating their way toward 2,500 tons of high explosive, and that when they reached it, nothing within half a mile would survive. So they did the only thing they could. They abandoned ship. They lowered the boats and rowed for their lives toward the far shore, screaming warnings the whole way. But they were screaming in French, and this was an English-speaking port. Almost no one who heard them understood a single word. So as the crew of the Mont-Blanc rowed frantically away from the burning ship, the people of Halifax did the opposite. They came to watch. And some came to help. A nearby tugboat, the Stella Maris, steamed straight toward the burning freighter and tried to fight the fire, then tried to tow her away from the docks. A British warship in the harbor sent a small boat of sailors over to assist. These were the people who understood, at least a little, that something was wrong, and who went toward it anyway. Almost all of them would be dead within minutes. The burning Mont-Blanc, now drifting and unmanned, nudged up against Pier 6 and set the wooden pier on fire. This is the part that's almost unbearable to think about. Children ran down to the waterfront for a better look. Workers stepped out of the factories. Dockhands paused on the piers. And in the houses on the hillside above the harbor, the working-class North End, packed with families, people crowded to their windows, pointing at the beautiful, strange colors dancing on the water below. It was a free show on a cold morning. A burning ship. How often do you see that? The fire was beautiful, and every second they watched it, they were being pulled closer to the largest explosion human beings had ever created. Which brings us back to Vince Coleman. Coleman was a train dispatcher. His office sat just a few hundred yards from Pier 6, well inside the kill zone, though no one had a word for that yet. A sailor came sprinting past, shouting about the cargo, about what was really on that ship. And somehow, Coleman understood. He understood what those French sailors had been screaming. He understood what was about to happen to everyone within half a mile. And he understood one more thing. There was an incoming passenger train, carrying around 300 people, due into Halifax any minute, rolling straight toward the blast zone. Coleman and his colleague turned and ran. They got clear. And then Vince Coleman stopped. He turned around, and he walked back into the office, back toward the burning ship, to send one last message up the line, to stop that train. We know what he wrote because it survived. He tapped out, "Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys." At 9:04 and 35 seconds in the morning, the Mont-Blanc detonated. I want to give you a sense of scale because the words "big explosion" don't come close. The blast released energy equal to roughly 2,900 tons of TNT. It was, by a wide margin, the largest man-made explosion in human history, and it would hold that record until the atomic bomb 28 years later. The ship, a steel freighter the length of a city block, was vaporized in an instant. Pieces of it were thrown across the entire region. The Mont-Blanc's anchor shaft, a piece of iron weighing over half a ton, was hurled more than 2 miles through the air and buried itself in the ground on the far side of the peninsula. A cannon from her deck flew 3.5 miles. Fragments of red-hot metal rained down across the city. For a fraction of a second, the temperature at the center of the blast was hotter than the surface of the sun. The explosion flattened almost everything within a half-mile radius instantly. The North End district of Richmond, home to thousands of working families, simply ceased to exist. More than 1,600 buildings were destroyed outright. 12,000 more were damaged. Fires broke out across the ruins as overturned stoves and lamps ignited the wreckage. Then came the water. The blast was so violent it momentarily shoved the water away from the harbor floor, and then the sea rushed back in as a tsunami, a wave that surged up the hillsides, swept people off the shore, and dragged wreckage back out into the harbor. On the Dartmouth side, a small Mi'kmaq community at Tufts Cove, which had lived on that shore for generations, was wiped off the map by that wave. The shock wave shattered windows 50 miles away. The sound was heard more than 200 miles away, in a different province. People felt the ground move from even farther than that. And then there were the windows, close in. Remember, half the city had been watching. Standing at their windows, faces inches from the glass, when the shockwave hit. The explosion turned every pane of glass in Halifax into a storm of flying razors. It blinded people, hundreds of them. The Halifax explosion caused one of the largest mass blindings in recorded history. A generation of survivors lived the rest of their lives without sight because they had come to the window to look at a fire. In total, the explosion killed an estimated 1,800 people and injured around 9,000 more. In a city of only 65,000, almost 1 in every 6 people was killed or wounded in a fraction of a second. Whole families were gone. Hundreds of children never came home from school or never made it to school at all. And then, that night, it began to snow. A blizzard rolled in over the wreckage. 16 inches of snow fell on a city with no shelter, no windows, no power, and thousands of injured people still trapped in collapsed buildings. The survivors who had just lived through the largest explosion in human history now faced freezing to death in the rubble. Rescuers dug through the ruins by hand, in the dark, in the storm. And there are stories from those hours that stay with you. A rescue crew was about to give up on one collapsed house when they heard a faint cry from beneath the wreckage. They dug down and pulled out a 23-month-old baby girl, alive, sheltered by pure chance under the ashpan of a cast-iron stove that had shielded her from the falling house. They called her Ashpan Annie. She lived to be 95 years old. For every story like hers, there were 100 that ended the other way. Parents who dug for days and found nothing. Children who woke up in hospitals as the only survivor of their entire family. The grief of that morning didn't end that morning. It echoed through the city for the rest of the century. When a city is destroyed in an instant, it needs an answer. It needs someone to blame. And so, within days, while the dead were still being pulled from the snow, an official inquiry began. The pressure was enormous, and so was the anger. People wanted a villain. They found one quickly. The Mont-Blanc. The French ship. The foreign ship full of explosives that no one had warned them about. The inquiry's first verdict landed hard on Captain Lemedec and the harbor pilot, Francis Mackey. They were blamed almost entirely for the disaster. There were even attempts to charge them with manslaughter. For a time, Mackey, a local pilot who had done nothing most other pilots wouldn't have done, became one of the most hated men in Canada, accused of killing his own neighbors. But here's the thing about needing a villain. It doesn't always survive contact with the facts. As the case wound its way upward through the courts, eventually all the way to Canada's highest court, a more honest picture emerged. This hadn't been one man's crime. It had been a chain of small, ordinary errors by both ships. The emo on the wrong side of the channel, the confused whistle signals, the panic, the reverse engines at exactly the wrong moment. In the end, the courts ruled that both vessels were equally to blame. The manslaughter charges collapsed. Mackey was never convicted of anything. His pilot's license was eventually restored, and he kept working the harbor for years. There was no villain. That was almost the hardest part to accept. 2,000 people died. A city was leveled. And it was nobody's grand, evil plan. It was just a handful of human beings, making small mistakes, on a morning that happened to have a bomb in it. But even as the inquiry searched for blame, something else was happening. Something better. Help was coming. Word of the disaster went out over the wires within hours, and the response was immediate. Relief trains rolled in from across Canada, and from the south, from the city of Boston, came something Halifax would never forget. When the news reached Boston, the state of Massachusetts didn't wait to be asked. Within a day, they loaded a train with doctors, nurses, and supplies and sent it racing north, straight into the same blizzard that was burying the survivors. They arrived fast, and they stayed, and they helped a wounded city stand back up. Halifax never forgot it. The rebuilding became one of the most ambitious efforts of its era. A relief commission was created to care for the wounded, the widowed, and the orphaned, some of them for the rest of their lives. The flattened North End was redesigned and rebuilt, including a district of fireproof concrete block homes that still stands today. The city that came back was not the same city. It carried its scars in its hospitals, in its cemeteries, in the empty chairs at thousands of dinner tables. But it came back. And out of all that suffering came knowledge that outlived everyone who suffered it. The mass blinding forced doctors to confront eye trauma on a scale no one had ever seen, and it pushed forward the care of the blind in Canada for decades. The flood of wounded children advanced the care of pediatric trauma and burns. Hard lessons, paid for in the worst possible currency. But there's one more legacy, and it's a chilling one. When scientists later began to understand the destructive power of a single, enormous explosion, When they needed real-world data on what happens to a city when that much energy is released at once, they had almost nothing to compare it to. Almost nothing. Because there had been exactly one event in human history at that scale: Halifax. In the years that followed, as researchers studied the effects of massive blasts on buildings and human beings, the Halifax explosion became a key reference point. The pattern of the destruction, the reach of the shockwave, the way the city had been flattened in concentric rings. It was studied by people trying to understand what a truly enormous bomb would do to a populated city. The disaster that no one chose, the accident in the harbor, quietly became a textbook for the atomic age. There's a quiet footnote to all this, and it's the part I love most. Every single year since the disaster, the people of Nova Scotia cut down one of their finest trees and ship it to the city of Boston as a thank you. For the doctors and nurses who came racing north through the blizzard in 1917. It stands on Boston Common as the city's official Christmas tree. A gift that has arrived, without fail, for over 100 years. Sent by the descendants of survivors to the descendants of the people who came running. Most of the people in Boston who walk past that tree have no idea why it's there. They don't know about the Mont-Blanc, or the sparks in the Benzol, or the two captains who turned the same way. They don't know about the windows, or the wave, or the baby under the stove. They don't know about a city that was leveled by an accident, looked for a villain, and slowly learned to forgive. And they definitely don't know about a railway dispatcher who had 4 minutes to live, and spent them sending a message to strangers. But now you do.